Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Saturday, June 21st, 2025, episode 418, and we're going to talk about where I've been for the last couple of days. So, a big storm ripped through the area, and unfortunately, I live in a neighborhood where a lot of the power lines are still above ground, and so a lot of old growth trees were knocked over, brought down a lot of lines. And so I think on Friday morning, 300,000 people still didn't have power. So it was a pretty violent storm. It was Thursday night. I was prepping an episode on Juneteenth, and the power went out. And power didn't come back until about 36 hours later on 1 a.m. Saturday morning, this morning. So, because I don't really have a lot of data on my phone, it was barely, and plus the problem was recharging it as well. So basically, I had a hard time even keeping up with the news, knowing what's going on. One thing I did catch, though, was the Ted Cruz interview with Tucker Carlson. Some might say that he is the smartest person in Congress. Oh, by the way, so basically it's Saturday. I normally don't do an episode on Saturday, but I figured I'd do a quick one just to explain where I've been, also to say something about the whole Ted Cruz thing. Some say that he's the smartest in Congress. He went to Princeton as an undergrad, then went to Harvard for law school. But his downfall, at least in that interview, was twofold, right? So he made a mistake. I mean, not to take anything away from him. Clearly, if I went head to head with him, he would wipe the floor with me. However, his downfall in this particular situation is illustrated by two mistakes. Number one, he usually has a friendly audience, I'm guessing, and people who do challenge him are not going to challenge him the way that Tucker Carlson did. People aren't trained to do that any longer. And so his points, which are extremely superficial, cannot be defended beyond the standard talking points. So if you're with a friendly audience, basically it's yes, of course, of course, right, right. And so people just go along with whatever he has to say. But of course, if you are not part of the friendly crowd, then you are going to draw attention to phrases, expressions, which need more explanation. And apparently he wasn't ready for that, which is kind of surprising. But then I guess a person can be lulled into a false sense of knowledge, of knowing what needs to be said if you've been spending most of your time, 99.9% of your time, with people who are friendly to you. And even if people are antagonistic to you, we all know that it would be from the mass media, mainstream media, and they're not allowed to ask difficult questions, especially since they want future interviews, and so they can't embarrass the person that they're interviewing. So that's the thing. I don't think he was ready at all. He had no intellectual depth to defend a lot of his ideas, especially the theological ones. And that's his second problem. He's wedded to a closed ideology. In episode 382, I talked about Christian Zionism, and so you can check that out if you want. But I want to go back further to episode 36, and every once in a while, I do talk about Bourdieu and his concept of fields and rules. That every discussion that you are going to have is a kind of field, right? And that field is governed by a set of rules. If you are accustomed to having debates and discussions on a field or with the stated rules that acknowledges and accepts as true Christian Zionism, then you're woefully unprepared for discussions off of that field. So if you want to, I think there's another episode. I can't recall, but one of the episodes I do discuss Bourdieu is episode 36. That's going way back. But it's basically what I said just now. So I generally in school I would say a book is a field, and the success of the book is determined by how well it adheres to its own rules. And so people who don't like a particular book, it's because they don't, and they don't say it this way, but they say, I don't like that book. Well, it's because they don't like either the field, because they're just not interested in the topic, or they don't like the rules that are governing the discussion in that book. Now, you can make a really convincing argument uh, in a very closed, narrow field. Everything makes sense. Everything is supported within the field. But once you are standing off of the field, looking onto the field, you have questions, questions that are not normally raised if you are actually sharing that subjectivity or if you are on that field with the same subjectivity. So on that field, if you are abiding by the rules and you have a certain subjectivity, then everything makes sense. But once you leave that field, then any argument that you make on that field is limited in its validity and relevance. So most of the world and Tucker Carlson is looking at the field that Ted Cruz is accustomed to discussing and looking at it from the outside, and it becomes really easy to pick apart, right? Because you're now on a different field, right? And you're observing that one, and now you see all of the problems. So, for example, the example I like to use is if you're playing football, American professional football, not soccer. If you're playing football, then all of the rules are clear. And then within that framework, then you play the sport. But if you are someone who is a baseball player looking at that field, you might ask questions like, well, when do you hit a home run? And there's no such a thing. It does not exist on that field. And then so the person from another field, they'll have lots of questions and they'll demand explanations and try to get an understanding with an understanding of professional football from the perspective of professional baseball. Very, very difficult, right? Because they're two completely different sports. However, if you are looking at a discussion topic like what Ted Cruz has been talking about, and you look at it from a non-Christian Zionist perspective, then you have lots of questions. And it appears that he wasn't ready for those questions. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a discussion on a certain narrow field if it's your personal opinion. The problem arises from the fact that he's in Congress and he's making his decisions for the rest of us based on his narrow understanding of scripture and of life on this planet. And that's where it becomes coercive. That's where it becomes subjective. That's where it becomes too narrow for actual lived life. And lots of people are going to suffer as a result. And so, in closing, I'm just going to share a little something that my kid, one of my kids, who went to a Shabbat last night. And obviously Friday night is when the Sabbath begins for people who are Jewish. And I guess the way that family does it is they turn it into a fellowship thing so that he can hang out with his friends as well. And he invites people who are Jewish and not Jewish. I mean, they're all high school friends. And so they're all rising juniors in college. Um, and I before he went, I thought I didn't say anything because I didn't want to influence him one way or the other, my kid. But I was very curious if they were going to talk about the events happening in Israel. And it seems, and they were playing games, and very frequently, if not constantly, was an expression of animosity towards Netanyahu and his policies, right? And so one thing that Ted Cruz could not do, most other people who are actually Jewish do all of the time, right? So Ted Cruz, who's a Christian Zionist, right? He's not Jewish. uh, cannot make a distinction between the Israeli government and the people of Israel, right? He couldn't make that, right? And it's the clips that I saw anyway. Tucker Carlson tried to pin him down, and he refused to go that direction. Because of course, if he did make a distinction, then clearly you can't invoke scripture to justify U.S. foreign policy today. Well, the kids are free to do that because they're not governed or restricted and restrained by politics. And they're really good kids. I've met some of them, and they told stories of where they go to school for college, that they're harassed everywhere they go for being Jewish. And they don't like it because there's that same conflation of the US government with anyone who's Jewish, or excuse me, the Israeli government with anyone who's Jewish, which is, you can't do that. That is a racialization, that is a generalization, a conflation, right? A creation of a racial category, and then treating anyone who can be put in that category in the same exact way, right? These college kids, they have no influence at all to Israeli foreign policy, to Israeli military policy. They have no influence at all. And quite frankly, they even don't care. So they're not fans, and I'm assuming too, just it seems that most kids that age are generally influenced by their families, and so it seems that their families as well, not big fans of what's going on. And it came up as well that they could all be drafted, and as a result, they should appreciate the time that they have right now, really enjoy it. Now, this is anecdotal, but I think it's really telling that most people do not want war, right? So we elect people to end all the wars and they turn around and do something else. This is not a representative government. Even right now, the majority of America is screaming, we don't want war. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the people want. And I think that at a certain point, uh, it's the government has to start paying attention to what the people want because it'll get dangerous for them, I think. In other words, all the harassment that is being directed towards like people who are Jewish because supposedly, apparently they're the same as the Israeli government, that absurdity is going to end and people are going to look for and then target the true source of all of this craziness that we're going through. If you listen to the guests on Judge Napolitano's podcast, Judging Freedom, you'll see that people have different takes, right? Who is actually in the White House? What kind of person is in the White House? Is he mentally competent? Is he not? Is he trying to buy time? I mean, who's actually in control? And there are lots of rumors. Rumors create suspicion, animosity, and fear. And it's what happens when a government or those who control the government get in trouble and they have an agenda which they are pursuing relentlessly with extreme prejudice. And of course, none of that has anything to do with us. I heard someone say, I think it was on Monaco 64's podcast interview. It was a couple of days ago, but they were talking about transnationals, people who stand above the nations and just want one world government, right? Maybe it's the WEF, but I think the WEF was a front. I think it was a distraction to direct people's attention away from the actual players, right? The wannabes, perhaps. But whoever is controlling all of the central banks of the world are these transnationals, and they have an agenda, and they will pursue it, right? And no one really cares, right? All they see is what is being discussed on the news or what the left is saying is the issues, are the issues. But for the rest of us, I really hope that all of us are able to rise above, be transnational, but in a peaceful sense, to try to bring sanity and rational thought back to the discussion to be able to see all of the angles, to be able to answer people's questions and challenges, and to represent the position of peace as truly the only and the best option for all of us moving forward. That's it. I just wanted to give you an update, and I will talk to you next time.